January 17th, 1945. Somewhere in the frost-choked forests of eastern Luxembourg. The snow fell in silence, thick and suffocating, blanketing the shattered remnants of what had once been a proud German defensive line. Among the skeletal trees and frozen earth, a single figure stood motionless. A Wehrmacht major, his uniform still pressed despite the chaos, his iron cross gleaming dully beneath the gray winter sky. His name was Klaus von Reichmann, a career officer of the old Prussian tradition, a man who had marched through Poland, France, and deep into Russia. He stood now before a cluster of American soldiers, their breath forming clouds in the bitter cold, their rifles trained on him with steady, patient hands. They had asked him to surrender. He had refused. Word traveled quickly up the chain of command. A German major, isolated and surrounded, clinging to a burned-out farmhouse with a handful of starving men, had declined the offer of honorable capitulation. The response that came back down the line carried the unmistakable signature of one man, Lieutenant General George S. Patton, Jr., commanding officer of the Third Army, a man whose very name had become synonymous with relentless forward motion, with iron will wrapped in profanity and brilliance. The answer was brief. It was delivered by a captain who had driven through shell-torn roads to reach the forward position, his jeep sliding on ice, his hands still numb from gripping the frozen steering wheel. He found the company commander, handed him a slip of paper, and waited. The company commander read it twice, then looked up at the farmhouse where the German major waited. The message contained no threats, no elaborate terms. It simply stated what would happen next. To understand what transpired in that frozen clearing requires understanding the man who would respond. George Patton was not merely a general. He was a student of warfare who had read Caesar and Napoleon, who had studied the campaigns of Alexander and Frederick the Great with the devotion of a monk poring over scripture. He believed in the warrior spirit, in the ancestral tradition of combat that stretched back through millennia. He also believed in speed, in shock, in the absolute necessity of breaking the enemy's will before breaking his body. To Patton, war was not a chess game, but a knife fight, brutal, personal, and decided by whoever struck first and hardest. By January 1945, Patton's Third Army had punched through the German counteroffensive in the Ardennes with a ferocity that stunned even his own superiors. While other Allied commanders urged caution, Patton had wheeled his entire army 90 degrees north in under 72 hours, smashing into the southern flank of the German Bulge with the force of a sledgehammer meeting glass. His tanks moved through snowdrifts and frozen roads that experts claimed were impassable. Their men fought in conditions that should have halted all offensive operations. They advanced anyway. The soldiers of the Third Army knew their commander's reputation. They knew he demanded the impossible and somehow made it happen. They also knew he had little patience for ceremony when battles remained to be won. Patton did not see war as a gentleman's duel. He saw it as existential contest, and he intended to win it decisively. Major von Reichmann, standing in that farmhouse, represented something Patton had encountered before. The old Prussian officer class, steeped in notions of honor and martial tradition, often clung to codes that the modern industrialized slaughter of the Second World War had rendered obsolete. Von Reichmann had expected, perhaps, the courtesies of an earlier age, a formal parley, discussions of terms, the ritualized ballet of honorable surrender between professional soldiers. He had imagined, in some corner of his mind, that his refusal would be met with respect, perhaps even admiration from his American counterparts. What he received instead was arithmetic.
The captain who delivered Patton's response explained it with the flat tone of a man reading a weather report. The farmhouse would be given one final opportunity to surrender. If the German major declined, American artillery, already ranged and registered on the position, would fire precisely 150 rounds of high-explosive shells into the structure and the surrounding tree line. Following the barrage, American infantry, supported by tanks, would advance and accept the surrender of any survivors. There would be no negotiation. There would be no delay. The major had 15 minutes to decide. Von Reichmann's hands trembled as he listened. Not from fear. He had faced Soviet artillery at Kursk, had watched entire battalions vanish into smoke and flame, but from the sudden, crushing realization that the enemy he faced did not share his understanding of warfare. The Americans were not interested in his honor. They were interested in moving forward. To them, he was not a worthy opponent deserving of respect. He was an obstacle, and obstacles were removed with maximum efficiency and minimum fuss. This was the fundamental difference, the philosophical chasm that separated the two armies in that frozen moment. The German military tradition, for all its tactical brilliance and operational skill, remained anchored to older concepts of war as a proving ground for national spirit, for individual courage, for the warrior virtues. Even in the mechanized horror of the Eastern Front, German officers often spoke of duty and honor as though these abstractions could substitute for the material realities of logistics, production, and manpower. Patton's America waged war differently. The United States did not romanticize combat, it industrialized it. American factories produced tanks, aircraft, and ammunition with the same ruthless efficiency they had once applied to automobiles and washing machines. American doctrine emphasized overwhelming firepower, combined arms coordination, and the absolute primacy of keeping friendly casualties to a minimum. If artillery could solve a problem, artillery would be used. If air power could break an enemy position, air power would be called. The American way of war was not personal, it was comprehensive. Major von Reichmann looked at his men, 18 soldiers, most of them conscripts, boys from Bavaria and the Rhineland who had never wanted to be in Luxembourg in January 1945. They watched him with hollow eyes, their faces gaunt from hunger, their hands wrapped in rags against the cold. He thought of the Iron Cross pinned to his chest, of his family's military lineage stretching back to the wars of Frederick the Great. He thought of honor. Then he thought of the 150 artillery shells that would arrive in 14 minutes. He walked out of the farmhouse with his hands raised. His men followed, one by one, shuffling through the snow toward the American lines. The Wehrmacht major still carried himself with rigid posture, his back straight despite exhaustion and defeat. When he reached the American captain, he attempted to offer his sidearm in the traditional gesture of formal surrender. The captain told him to keep it and get in the truck with the others. They would be processed at the POW facility 3 miles back. The captain had a schedule to maintain. The detail Patton's men remember most clearly from these final months was not the fighting, but the expression on German prisoners' faces. Captured soldiers expected brutal treatment. They had been told for years that the Americans were gangsters, that the British were cruel imperialists, that capture meant torture and death. Instead, they were given medical care, food, and cigarettes. They were housed in camps where International Red Cross representatives monitored conditions. They were fed rations that exceeded what many of them had eaten in the last year of the war.
One Wehrmacht sergeant captured near the Rhine in March 1945 later wrote in his diary about the moment American guards distributed chocolate bars to the POW column. He had not tasted chocolate since before the invasion of France in 1940. He stood in the winter rain, holding the Hershey bar in his trembling hands, and wept. Not from gratitude, he was still a prisoner, still defeated, but from the sudden, overwhelming comprehension of what Germany had challenged. The Americans had chocolate to spare for their enemies, while German civilians starved. The material disparity was not merely numerical, it was civilizational. This chocolate bar became, for that sergeant and thousands like him, a symbol more devastating than any artillery barrage. It represented abundance, stability, a society that could wage total war across 2 oceans while still maintaining enough surplus to treat its prisoners humanely. It shattered the propaganda mythology he had been fed about decadent democracies on the verge of collapse. Patton himself never recorded his thoughts on Major von Reichmann specifically. The incident was too minor, too routine in the final grinding months of the European campaign. By January 1945, Patton's Third Army was accepting surrenders daily, processing thousands of German soldiers whose world had collapsed around them. What consumed Patton's attention was the race to the Rhine, the coming thrust into Germany's industrial heartland, the burning desire to beat the British to Berlin. But the philosophy behind his response to the German major's refusal was entirely consistent with everything Patton believed about warfare and will. Patton understood that modern combat was ultimately psychological. Physical destruction mattered less than the enemy's belief in his ability to resist. Once that belief crumbled, organized resistance became impossible. The key was to attack not just the enemy's forces, but his confidence, his cohesion, his very reason for continuing to fight. The offer to Major von Reichmann had been calculated with precision. 15 minutes was long enough to make a rational decision, but too short for bravado to sustain itself. 150 artillery rounds was specific enough to be credible, large enough to be terrifying. The message contained no anger, no moral condemnation, just the cold promise of overwhelming force applied without hesitation or regret. This was American power distilled to its essence. Not the heroic charge or the last stand, but the inexorable application of industrial might backed by unshakable logistical foundations. Germany had chosen to fight the United States, believing that democratic societies lacked the stomach for total war, that pluralistic nations could never match the focused willpower of totalitarian systems. In that frozen farmhouse, Major von Reichmann learned otherwise. The war would continue for another 4 months, but its outcome had long since been decided. Germany's factories lay in ruins beneath American and British bombers. Its fuel reserves had evaporated. Its veteran divisions had been ground to dust in Russia and replaced with boys and old men. The German army in the West was not fighting to win, but to delay the inevitable, to buy time for a miracle that would never arrive. Patton's Third Army crossed the Rhine in March, drove through Bavaria in April, and was driving toward Czechoslovakia when word came that Hitler had killed himself in his bunker beneath Berlin. The war in Europe ended not with a dramatic final battle, but with millions of German soldiers surrendering en masse, choosing captivity over death in defense of a regime that had already ceased to exist. Among those millions, scattered across POW camps from France to Texas, were men who had stood where Major von Reichmann stood, officers who had expected honor and received efficiency, soldiers who had anticipated cruelty and found chocolate instead. They carried these experiences home when the war ended, quiet truths that no propaganda ministry could erase. In the end, what defeated Germany was not merely American firepower or Soviet manpower, it was the comprehensive superiority of societies that could wage total war without sacrificing their fundamental character. Nations that could build both bombers and washing machines, that could fight across the globe while maintaining democratic institutions and the rule of law. The chocolate bars given to prisoners, the medical care provided to enemy wounded, the refusal to descend into the barbarism Germany had embraced, these were not signs of weakness, but demonstrations of civilizational strength. Major von Reichmann survived the war. He spent 2 years in a camp in Kansas, working on farms and learning rudimentary English. When he returned to Germany in 1947, he found his country divided, his cities destroyed, his military traditions shattered. He never spoke publicly about the moment he surrendered in Luxembourg, but his children later reported that he kept, until his death in 1983, a small notebook in which he had written a single line in English, copied carefully from an American newspaper he had read in the POW camp. "We hold these truths to be self-evident." Whether he believed those words or simply found them worth remembering, no one could say, but he had learned what Patton had known all along, that wars are won not by those who fight hardest, but by those who can sustain the fight longest, who possess not just the weapons, but the industrial base, the political will, and the moral foundation to see the conflict through to its conclusion. The snow had long since melted from that farmhouse in Luxembourg. The trees grew back, the scars of artillery faded, but the lesson remained, carved into history with the same precision Patton had applied to everything he touched, that power without restraint is tyranny, but power combined with principle is unstoppable.